Hey folks, Frank Bowl here. We got a special day for you. This is a Wednesday, I know, but we're going to redrop our podcast from August 15th with the fascinating Terence O'Malley and Nelly Don, A Stitch in Time. Why? Because Nelly Don is coming to a theater near you. Terence O'Malley has totally reworked this, and it is now a musical. Nelly Don, A Stitch in Time. Enjoy our rebroadcast with Terence O'Malley from August 15th, and then go to a local theater near you and see the new musical, Nelly Don, A Stitch in Time. Enjoy. The guy sitting right across from me is going to remind you, once we start talking to him for a while, his name is Terence O'Malley, and once we start talking to him for a while, he's going to remind you of that guy from the Dos Equis commercials, okay? The most interesting man in the world. This guy is the most interesting man in Kansas City, and you'll see what we mean as his books just fell down. But we will just go from there, Terence. And you are an author, documentary filmmaker, a lawyer, and you're going to do a musical on one of your documentary films, and you've written some really interesting books and really interesting things about the history of Kansas City and some of the things that make this place what it is. And that's what we're here about the conversation about.
Yeah. Well, I'm born and raised in Kansas City, and so I have an innate interest in a lot of the history about Kansas City. In some ways experienced it, and so it's really been my great privilege to get to be able to write about these subjects and bring some of these stories to life. Yeah,
and when you start talking about the books and the documentaries, and folks, I'll just give you a real quick synopsis here. Nelly Don, A Stitch in Time. We will talk about her, which gets very interesting when she gets kidnapped and then rescued by the mafia. Yeah, that happened. Shooting Back in Time, the Union Station Massacre, Black Hand Straw Man, the history of organized crime in Kansas City, Tom and Harry, the boss and the president, which is Tom Pendergast and Harry Truman, of course. He has been interviewed by Anthony Bourdain on No Reservations, and he did the interview at BB's Lawnside Barbecue when he did it with Anthony Bourdain, which is great. And when we talk about Nelly Don, there will be a musical as well. Why in this venue, why in this genre did you get interested to do it?
Nelly Don specifically?
Yeah, we'll talk about her first.
Yeah, that's the first feature-length documentary that I did. And I had always had the Nelly Don story in my back pocket because she is my great aunt, technically my great aunt, but these are large Irish Catholic families, and
we know how they go.
Yeah, I mean, her oldest sister was almost 20 years older than her, and gave birth to my grandmother when Nell was like 2.5 years old. So Nell was actually the aunt to my grandma, who was only 2.5 years younger than her. So they grew up like sisters. That's why I always say she's just kind of like my great aunt,
Right. And Nelly Don, everybody's going to say, well, she was a dressmaker, right? I mean, for people who are going to go,
was.
Or who was Nelly Don?
Well, it was interesting when I was, telling people. It took me 3 years to do the research and make the film. And when I was telling people I'm making this documentary about this lady who made dresses, it was kind of like yawn, like, seriously? Why do you think anybody's going to care? And I said, yeah, you don't understand. First of all, she was the largest dressmaker in the world during the 20th century. It's estimated that they basically made up to 75 million dresses here in Kansas City. The company started in 1916, went all the way to 1978. Even on the day that it shut its doors, it was still employing more than 900 people. So they were making dresses right up to the very last minute there. And by 1931, they were making 1.5 million dresses a year. And after World War II, that was about 5,000 dresses a day. And then after World War II, they were making 7,000 dresses a day. So they were huge.
Right, and they were very affordable as well, right? I think the first one sold for $1.
Yeah,
Is that right?
Well, I mean, that's Nell's story, and so we went ahead and stuck with her story that she rejected the 69-cent calico cloth Mother Hubbard-style dresses that were available at the dry goods stores, and she went around and sold what we would call bungalow aprons, these very simple little frilly frocks. And she got rejected at several of the department or dry goods stores. They were the precursor to the department stores, and until she came across this store called Peck's at 12th and Main, and they said, "All right, we'll take a chance on you," and they ordered 18 dozen dresses to be done in 30 days. Well, then it was like, oh my God,
Now I got to find some people to do this.
Exactly. So she got her family, friends, and neighbors together, and in her living room over on Montgall, and started sewing, and was able to make the deadline. And I think at that moment is probably when she invented the assembly line manufacturing technique applied to dresses. And she did model things off of Henry Ford, and she also modeled her dress manufacturing off of the sectional technique of the aviation industry. So she was a great student of fashion manufacturing. And I mean, I think that really she was a manufacturing genius because, and you're right, I mean, there were three elements to her dresses. First of all, their design was really pleasing to the eye. Secondly, their manufacturing was the highest standard, highest quality. And thirdly, they were affordable.
Yeah, and they fit virtually everybody as well, right?
Right,
Which
exactly.
is really important because if you were a small woman or a bigger woman or whatever, those dresses, the way they were made, fit you.
Well, and she had techniques for doing that. She would always include lots of additional material inside the seams so you could let them out or take them in as need be. They always had to have a pocket. She was the first one to put removable shoulder pads into dresses. She's the first one to put a label on dresses. She's the first one to put the little extra buttons that you see, a lot of times in shirts and dresses and things like that. She just advanced garment manufacturing by so much, early on. Yeah.
So, and then the thing for me, so she actually becomes maybe at the time the richest woman in the world.
She was the second self-made woman millionaire in business in the United States. So there was a woman ahead of her, and her product was brassieres. So, but Nell was number two as being heralded as the second self-made woman millionaire in business in the United States. And so the company, their first plant was at the Western Auto Building, right there on Grand Street. And they were there from about 1919 to 1928. Then they moved to the Corrigan Building, which is at 1828 Walnut. And they were there for 20 years. And then she built the largest manufacturing plant on the face of the planet for dresses at 17th and Indiana. And then Nell retired in 1956. She started the company in 1916. She sold in 1956 to a consortium of mostly men who were her relatives. And they ran the company pretty darn well for the next 14 years. And then they sold again. And the gentleman who bought it had this idea of franchising Nelly Don fabrics, which they were famous for. Well, Nell always thought that was a ludicrous idea because it's like, hey, we make dresses meant to be bought right off the rack at the stores. Why would you compete with yourself by offering raw garment material? So that didn't really fly very well. So that ended up, spelling the demise of the company. So it was in business for 62 years.
Okay, well, she becomes one of the richest women in the world, and therefore, during that time, through part of that time, we get into depression, we get into people need money. So now all of a sudden there is a huge twist in this story.
Well, there
is. It
is.
makes this so interesting.
It's a very intimate and personal story, but the fact of the matter is that Nell was married to a gentleman named Paul Donelly. That's where they got the name. They inverted Donelly and made it Nelly Don. So Nell was always perceived as Nelly Don to the outside world. That's just who she became. And they became very wealthy during the 1920s. But Paul himself slowly became a what I call a philandering dipsomaniac, frequenting the the speakeasy
The
along 12th
establishments,
Street.
yes.
Yeah. And becoming more manic, depressed, and he would come back from like a drinking binge, and he and Nell would get into an argument, say at the factory, and this is a story that's told by even more intimates in the family, and he would threaten to kill himself if she got pregnant. It's this weird thing that they hadn't been able to have any children. Now, Nell was from a big family. She was used to having big families.
Right.
So I think it was a little disappointing for her to not have had any children up to that point. And she's like in her late 30s, early 40s. And he is exhibiting this neurotic behavior. And so that was kind of the status of things. And he was obviously not being faithful to her. And so she had this apron called the Handy Dandy apron, and the genius behind it was that you could sew the entire outer seam of the apron without ever removing it from the sewing machine. So she patented that herself. And there was a company in St. Louis that knocked it off. And so she hired a local lawyer, a very well-known lawyer named James A. Reed, to be her attorney. He was still at the time a sitting United States senator.
Senator, yes.
And he himself is a fascinating character in the annals of Kansas City history. He's the first mayor under the Pendergast. He prosecuted the Swope murder trial. He also he defended Myrtle Bennett, the famous bridge trial, when Myrtle Bennett accidentally shot her husband 5 times in the back over a game of bridge. Nell hires James A. Reed to prosecute this case in St. Louis's patent infringement case, and he wins the case. And I think at that moment is when Nell became, not infatuated, but certainly developed an affinity for James A. Reed.
Right.
She liked him. He was very florid in his oratory, and he was, senatorial, and he had this, elegant demeanor to him. And they had an affair together. In fact, Reed arranged for Nell and Paul to move in behind him. He was at 52nd Cherry and arranged for Nell and Paul to move into what is now known as the Toy and Miniature Museum house right there on Oak Street, 52nd and Oak Street. And it was during that time that Nell got pregnant. And so...
Remember, her husband was threatening to kill himself if she ever got pregnant. Yes.
Yeah. And also... Reed was still married at the time, too. His wife was not in great health, but nevertheless, he was still married. So the two of them, they got pregnant together while they're both married to other people.
Right.
And you're talking, this is 1931. So the mores of the time would not have allowed for this type of news to get out. Because
especially two such famous people.
Right. Right. It would have been like, major national headlines and that sort of thing. So what developed was Nell came up with this plan that she would make up a story to go over to France and adopt a baby, which she did. She frequently went over to Europe to study fashion design. And but she did go over to France, and then she went through Ireland, but she came back through Chicago and delivered a healthy baby boy in Chicago at St. Luke's Hospital, and then came back to Kansas City and basically held the child up as her adopted child. Now, why would she do that if she was still married? She could have just said, well, it's Paul Donnelly's child. Well, I think that she knew that her marriage to Paul Donnelly was not going to last, and she did not want people thinking that this child was the product of Paul Donnelly. And so they made up that story, and that's the story that was sold till the end of her days.
Yes, and she lived to 102, so there was a long. She had a long
People
number
just
of
kind of
days
dropped
left.
it. It was just kind of something that wasn't really spoken a lot about. But you can definitely see James A. Reed in the progeny of that have come since. So and then interestingly enough, just to wrap that up, so Well, so the baby is born in September of 1931. Well, it was 3 months later when, her life changed due to a criminal event.
Yeah, right. I guess her and her chauffeur they were coming out of the house.
Well,
No, they were returning to the house,
Yes,
right?
uh-huh.
And there were two guys there in the driveway with a car. It looked like the car was broken down or something of
That's
that
right.
nature. And then all of a sudden, it was
Well, what's
a
interesting.
bizarre 48 hours after that, right?
It really was, because they had the car parked there. And if you go to where the Toy and Miniature Museum is, the driveway is exactly the same. It hasn't changed a bit, from the photographs back in the day. But yes, there was a car block, and they were acting like their car was broken down. And her young African-American chauffeur, George Blair, sounded the horn, and they approached the car and said, "Hey, can you help us? Our car's broken." And he said, "Hey, you got to get that car out of the way." And then next thing you know, they rushed the car. Two guys jumped in the front seat with George and started beating him and pistol whipping him and things like that. And then a guy jumped into the back seat with Nell. And they took off, headed south on Oak. They cut over on Westover, and they drove all the way out into the country to 75th and Mission, where they exchanged cars.
Where the roads were still gravel at that time and dirt.
Yeah, exactly right. And then they took her up to an abandoned farmhouse in Wyandotte County, up by where the racetrack is now. But when they were first abducting the two of them, the guys in the front say Nell was putting up a heck of a fight. She was screaming and yelling and, trying to get somebody's attention. And the guys in the front seat said, shut her up, hit her, beat her, choke her, do whatever you got to do. So the guy in the back seat just grabbed her neck and started squeezing on her neck and started suffocating her. And so it was at that moment she knew she had to give up.
Right.
So she was basically complied with them from that point, and they took him to this farmhouse, and she had to write ransom notes under flashlight.
Right. And now all of a sudden she's missing. James A. Reed is very concerned. I'm sure her husband was as well, but James A. Reed is very concerned about where the woman who's had his child is.
His
right?
only child,
His
too.
only child
He'd
is.
never had a child, and he is 26 years older than Nell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he goes and he enlist's a little help.
He does. It's interesting. He's trying the famous Ha Ha Tonka lawsuit down in Jefferson City, which is about the condemnation of the lands. And one of the major witnesses in that was Gutzen Borglum, who was the sculptor of Mount Rushmore.
Oh, my God.
And he did a beautiful bust of James A. Reed. It's still in the family. But so anyway, Reed hears, word comes to him that Nelly Don's been kidnapped. So he goes rushing out of the courtroom. Well, there were reporters there covering that. So when Reed got back to the Toy and Miniature Museum house, it was swarming with police and reporters, and he realizes he's made a mistake because he's drawn this attention.
Right.
So he holds a news conference live on the air on the radio, and I think WDAF is what comes to mind for me.
Yes, right.
Was
back in those days.
yeah,
Yeah,
right. And anyway, because Nell and George Blair, her chauffeur, could hear the press conference with Reed, and he beseeched the kidnappers to please not hurt her. That it was his responsibility that that the information about the kidnapping got out. But then he went on to threaten them that if they hurt her, harmed one hair on her head, that he would track them down to the ends of the earth and make sure that they got the most severe penalty under the law, which at the time was death by hanging for kidnapping in Missouri.
Right.
And then he went in, after the news conference was concluded, he went to a back room, picked up the phone, and called Johnny Lazia.
Who was one of Pendergast's, Tom Pendergast's. He was the face for Tom Pendergast and what they were trying to do, right?
I would say he was the face of what was the burgeoning of organized crime in Kansas City.
Okay.
Johnny Lazia came to the fore because in 1928, in a municipal election, he and his henchmen kidnapped 4 Pendergast poll workers and put guns to their head and sent a note to Boss Tom saying, "Look, we're going to kill these guys if you don't give us political control." They wanted what's called home rule over the north end Italian sector of Kansas City at that time. And, Pendergast first said, well, hey, instead of, why don't we do this? Why don't you have a club, a political club, and I'll have a political club? And Lazia would not accept that deal. And so Pendergast could not go to war with Lazia. And so he said he acquiesced at that point. Well, at that point, then Lazia and Tom Pendergast became very close associates, and they worked very closely together on how things worked in Kansas City.
Back in those days.
Yeah, back in the day, yeah.
Sure.
I mean, Tom wasn't a gangster. He was a political influencer, and he was a businessman. And Lazia was a businessman. It's just that his business, transcended the legal and went into the illegal realm of things. And because this is still during Prohibition.
Yeah, right. So they're making booze and beer and selling it and having speakeasies, and they have houses of prostitution, and they, the whole thing. They had the whole deal running at that time, which is where they made money.
Yeah.
And I think what people forget too is everybody talks about New York and Chicago during those days. We've seen The Godfather and whatever, but you see that. I think people lose sight of how big Kansas City was in the mafia.
Well, I think Kansas City has a disproportionate role in the national syndicate for a city of its size. And I think the reason is because during the Pendergast era, our criminal families were able to gel in such a way that they couldn't in most other cities, because Pendergast allowed all kinds of what you might consider soft crime to proliferate.
Just look the other way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they purposely paid the police officers very poorly. I mean, it was like, I think, $1,300 a year, and they had to buy their own blackjack, their own billy club, their own service revolver. They had to buy their own uniforms.
So they needed money.
They needed money, and so the whole idea is pay them very poorly so that they'll take bribes from the sin businesses and just look the other way. And that worked very well for many years. And then it came to light that 10% of Kansas City's police force during the 1930s were ex-cons, convicted felons, serving as police officers on the police force. So it was a very corrupt situation here in Kansas City. And, of course, though, there's a pro and a con to all of it, right?
Absolutely,
and
yes.
the pro was that, all these clubs, these bars, these speakeasies, and it's amazing, especially if you look after Prohibition. I mean, you'll have 2 full pages in the newspapers of one club after another advertised, live music. So just literally many hundreds of musicians flocked to Kansas City from Arkansas and Oklahoma and all over the region, Texas. They came from everywhere because there were jobs in Kansas City, steady paying gig jobs for musicians. And so that's how we became a cradle of jazz. And I think that Tom Pendergast, He by the 1930s, he was a 60-year-old man, and so he wasn't out frequenting the speakeasies.
Right.
He was just taking a cut off of.
He was sitting at home counting his money.
That's basically right. It was delivered to him at 1908 Main Street.
Okay, so James A. Reed goes to Tom Pendergast and says, Get Nelly Don back.
Yeah.
Could you know anybody and get her back? I'm sure the first thing he said was, "You didn't take her, did you? You guys didn't take her, did you? You didn't kidnap?" And they went, "No." And so he hires these guys, or not hires them, but says
threatens them.
He threatens them. Get my wife, or get the mother of my child back.
Well,
since he's not married to her at this point.
Get Mrs. Donnelly back.
Get Mrs. Donnelly back.
You're right.
Right.
Lazia said, "Hey, Senator, we didn't have anything to do with this." He said, "I know, but you know how to get her back.
Yeah.
And I'm giving you 24 hours to do so, or else I'm going to buy a half an hour of national radio time and expose your syndicate activities here in Kansas City." And that's the last thing that a mobster needs is that type. And also, you got to appreciate who James A. Reed was. He was a real firebrand. I mean, if this guy was coming after you, you got problems, because he didn't let it go. And he knew how. He was a good lawyer, great lawyer, and very powerful. In fact, he just came second to Al Smith, Tammany Hall's candidate, who ran against Herbert Hoover and lost. But Reed was at that convention and darn near got the presidential nomination. So he was a national figure. He's on the cover of Time magazine and very well known. And so I'm sure that scared not only Johnny Lazia and company, but I'm sure that also had an effect on the kidnappers themselves.
and the amazing thing about the kidnappers are They were from South Africa.
Well, they weren't. No, what happened was,
or they fled to South.
Yeah, that's what
they ended up in South Africa.
They ended
somehow,
up in South Africa. So what happened was,
and they thought it was far enough away.
Well, Lazia gets the call, and so he basically, he gets threatened with this. And you have to understand, Lazia actually contributed to the solution of at least a couple, if not several, big crimes in Kansas City, because he went around and collected the money for the Mary McElroy kidnapping as well. That was the city manager's daughter. She was kidnapped.
Right.
What happened was you had like 25 carloads of gangsters out on the street of Kansas City searching for Nelly Don, and through some really inventive investigative technique, they found out where she was, and they broke into the farmhouse at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they basically dispatched the kidnappers. And when they got into the room where Nell and the chauffeur were being held, Nell thought that they were being taken for a ride, that they were going to be taken and shot. Well, what she said, and this was at trial, she said that these men came into the room and they said, "Get up, come on, we're leaving." And at that time, she thought, "Okay, they're going to execute us." And but she said they took us out to these beautiful, bright, shiny new cars. I can't tell. I don't know if they were Cadillacs or Buicks, but they were really nice cars. And the newspaper reports that as Johnny Lazia and his gang were heading back east into Kansas City from Kansas City, Kansas, there was a bunch of cop cars heading west out to
Too late.
Yeah, so they dropped Nell and the chauffeur off at an all-night diner in Kansas City, Kansas, called the cops and said, "You'll find her here." And so Lazia then came back at Reed came back at Lazia and said, "All right, who were these guys?" And Lazia said, "Hey, that wasn't the deal. The deal was we get her back. You got to figure out who it was." And Lazia knew who it was.
Yeah.
But yes, they eventually tracked the lead kidnapper. He got on a boat called the City of New York, and he took it all the way down to South Africa. And he was down in South Africa, and he went to the local consulate there looking for maybe some work to do. Mm-hmm. And back in the day, that's when like true crime magazines and had all these different names for all these different crime magazines, kind of the equivalent of America's Most Wanted today. Mm-hmm. And they recognized the guy because they kind of figured out who it was, so they published the guy's picture. So that they got hold of the Kansas City Police Department and said, "Hey, we got this guy down here. We think he's your guy." And so 2 Kansas City police detectives got on a boat and went all the way to South Africa to grab this guy.
You're not climbing on a 747
no.
and going to Cape Town.
No. I mean, that's probably at least a 2-week trip,
At least. Oh, they probably loved it.
I know.
You had a great time.
Yeah, because all they have to do is go grab this guy and come on back. But let's see, 3 people were prosecuted. 2 of them got life sentences, and one of them got 35 years.
Okay.
So it was
but they
very
didn't
serious.
hang them.
No, they didn't hang them. Nell didn't want them to be hanged either.
Okay.
She
Yeah.
She had a very soft heart in that way.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that was great. Well, that's Nelly Don, and now you're going to tell me, folks, after that story you just heard, this is going to be a musical. Okay.
Yeah. It is a musical.
So it is a musical, and it will be released, I think.
Well, it's a musical movie. We released. We did do the play down at Crown Center Musical Theater Heritage in March of 2019. Okay. And we opened on Thursday, and it was sold out by Tuesday. So a lot of people got to see that play, a musicalized version of this story. But yes, we spent last year in principal photography shooting Nelly Don, the musical movie, here in Kansas City. We had Heather Laird was our casting director, and I think she had 215 applications of people who wanted to be in the film.
Sure.
And then she winnowed that down to about 115, and then we actually auditioned 85 Kansas Cityans for it. And so it's a total Kansas City film. All of the actors and actresses, all the performers are Kansas City, all the extras are Kansas City, all the crew is Kansas City. The composer, Daniel Doss, my collaborator, he's from Kansas City, so it's a great telling.
And you wrote the lyrics?
I did. I wrote what they call in the musical, you call it the book. I wrote the book and the lyrics, and then Daniel helped with the lyrics and composed the music, and then we had a different arranger.
Wow.
And then, for the movie, I'm the director of the movie, and I wrote the screenplay, and I'm also the editor of the movie as well.
and the other thing is, since this is sort of evergreen, it will be released in September of 2023.
What I'm shooting
so,
for.
yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, which is just incredible.
And the songs are beautiful, and the performances are great. And so I hope people just take it for what it is. It's just a real fun.
I was going to say
ride.
it's because nothing. Nelly Don didn't die during the kidnapping or anything of that nature. Then shortly after.
Well, let me give you the coda real quickly.
Okay, go ahead.
So
yeah.
what happened was
this is after she gets
this is December 1931 when the kidnapping. So she gets back home. She's of course, elated to get to see her baby again. And then in October 1932, Reed's first wife dies. In November of 1932, Nell divorces Paul Donnelly, her first husband, gives him $1 million and says, go away. And he financed the acting career of a young ingenue in Broadway. And then in December of 1933, Reed and Nell held a holiday party, and there was a federal judge there and asked everyone to rise and bear witness, and they got married right there on the spot.
Wow. And
then so after they were married, I always tell people the baby was David Reed, who grew up to be a wonderful man. And I always say David Reed has the distinction of having been adopted by both his natural parents, It's kind of crazy. And then Nell went on to run that company.
Right.
She basically provided most of the women in service uniforms and the Rosie the Riveter type of work clothes for women during World War. She was honored a couple of times, got the Army Navy E for Excellence Award a couple of times. That's the highest civilian award you could get. And, Look magazine sent Stanley Kubrick to do a photo shoot on her, and Robert Altman directed one of her industrial films, and NBC Radio dramatized her life in 1948 in The Golden Needle, and Dorothy McGuire played Nelly Don.
Oh, my gosh.
So it's not like, I found this, pearl, that nobody knew. Nell was big in her day, It's just that I knew that her story was being lost to time, and so I basically revived it again.
Yeah, and that's why you're here.
Yeah.
I mean, and and this is so interesting what we're doing today with you with the Nelly Don thing, but there's 3 or 4 more other books here.
Sure.
And documentary films that you've done. We're going to have you in periodically, but let's, to just maybe every few months or something, bring you in and we'll do another one. But let's do we'll do the Reader's Digest version of some of the other ones. Shooting back in time, the Union Station Massacre.
Yeah, so the way I got onto that was the 75th anniversary of the massacre was coming up in 2008.
Right.
And I was researching my book and film, Black Hand Straw Man, The History of Organized Crime in Kansas City. And, frankly, I didn't know that I was going to include the Union Station in my film, Black Hand Straw Man, until I started researching it and realized that Johnny Lazia was responsible for supplying the firearms to the bad guys. And then also he's the one who hooked up Vern Miller and Pretty Boy Floyd the night before the massacre.
Right.
And so I'm like, oh, well, God, this is clearly organized crime. It was rogue criminals perpetrating the act, but it was the nexus with organized crime that facilitated it.
Yeah, it all worked. It all started to work together. Who they were, and of course, several police officers died in the the interim of that, and the aftermath of that was the FBI.
Yeah. Really, the FBI, the modern FBI, as we would think about it today, really was born in that moment. Because
J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, it gave him the ammunition he needed to go before Congress to enlarge the powers that his agents had. At that time, his agents had very limited jurisdiction in enforcing prohibition laws and enforcing laws on Indian reservations. Just very limited, and so basically expanded the FBI into the police force that we know it today.
Right.
But to this day, the FBI still denies that it was friendly fire that ignited the shootout there at Union Station, but it clearly was, and it was documented back in the day. But Hoover just would not hear of it and just continued to basically gloss over that and just say no, it was, and in a way he's right. I mean, it was friendly fire that blew off Frank Nash's head, the criminal that they were escorting back to Leavenworth, but also killed FBI agent Caffrey. And and I think he was the second, maybe the first, but I think he was the second bureau agent killed while in service for the FBI. So his was a major, really a demarcation for the FBI. Yeah. But really quickly about the film, it's a 40-minute film. And really, I want to redo the film. We need to redo that film. I've done all of the research, and I know exactly, to the extent that people can know exactly what happened. But the 24 hours leading up to the massacre are fascinating because you got Pretty Boy Floyd, who has kidnapped a Missouri sheriff from a small town in Bolivar, Missouri, and he and his cohort his little drunk friend Adam Ricchetti. They're making their way to Kansas City, and meanwhile they've grabbed Frank Nash down in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And so his buddy Vern Miller gets pulled off the golf course here. And I've always thought golf and organized crime are an interesting parallel. Yeah, they are. There's just so much about. I mean, they go to Nick Savella was arrested on a golf course,
right?
And Vern Miller had to get pulled off a golf course. Wolf Ryman was executed by the mafia, and he was the golf pro at Hillcrest. So just all these connections with golf. But anyway, so. What I'd like to do, the 100th anniversary is going to come up in 2033, and so I'd really like to redo that film using today's production.
Oh gosh, yes, it would be amazing.
Right.
I mean, it'd be a real movie. It could be a real
really
movie.
Should be a real movie.
Yeah.
It was a movie in the 1970s. It was terrible. Bo Hopkins, I think, played Pretty Boy Floyd, and you couldn't find a guy who looked less like Pretty Boy Floyd, So, right. But yeah, it needs to be redone. And then I also came out in 2008 with Black Hand Strawman, The History of Organized Crime in Kansas City, and that really is an anthology of crime in Kansas City.
Right.
And then I came out with a book a couple of years later, simply because it just took me that long to write this book. I mean, if you look at this book, there is no other mafia book like this because it's really a pastiche of artifacts, mementos, graphics, photographs, exhibits, evidence, and of course, lots and lots of pictures of the gangsters in Kansas City throughout time. So it's unique.
It's a history book.
Yeah, and it's unique in that way, in the sense that most mafia books are written in a very, narrative form. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a very graphical form, if you will.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh, that's amazing. And then you wrote in 2012, I think you did a documentary on this as well as Tom and Harry. It's about Tom Pendergast, the boss, and the president of the United States, Harry Truman.
Yeah. And
how he actually helped propel
their relationship
Harry Truman that way.
I mean, a lot of when biographers come to Kansas City and they tell the story of Harry Truman, they don't have a lot of time to spend on the Pendergast machine. They'll usually just make some type of, passing reference that Harry was associated with this, corrupt, sinister political organization, which he was. But you have to understand, well, why was he? Why was a guy like Harry Truman engaged with this element of society, right? And so this film really is, I think, the quintessential telling of the Pendergast machine, because I go right back to its very beginnings with Big Jim Pendergast, Tom's oldest brother, who opened a saloon called the Climax in the West Bottoms. And the way he got his name was that he bet on a racehorse named Climax, and he won enough winnings to buy this saloon. And so he called it the Climax.
Well, that's amazing. It sounds like the Rooney family in Pittsburgh, where Art Sr. was at the racetrack, won enough money, and he bought the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Is that right?
So instead of buying a bar or a place like that, he bought the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Well, he probably won
instead.
more than Jim Pendergast did then.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure he did.
Yeah, well, those are great stories. But so Big Jim Pendergast was really the guy who started the Pendergast machine. And, I compared the two brothers. Big Jim Pendergast was an upstanding guy. He never engaged in the criminality that his brother did later on. But he was very soft on issues like, illegal alcohol distribution and consumption and gambling. He just didn't really care. And frankly, prostitution.
Yeah.
It was just like, this is just something people are going to do. It's in our nature. So why are we fighting it? Let's just learn to figure out to live with it. And so, but otherwise, he advanced a lot of positive things. And probably the biggest thing that he is known for, there's quite a few things, but he did not stand in the way of the relocation of the rail depot from the West Bottoms to where Union Station is today. There was a big vote on that, and I think the vote was in 1910 or 1911, because construction, I think, started in 1912. Mm-hmm. And so everybody thought that Big Jim Pendergast would oppose this because it would basically decimate his political district. His district was the West Bottoms. A lot of people used to live there because that's where the industrial sector of Kansas City was. And so he didn't stand in the way. In fact, he got behind the relocation of the rail depot. And so the city fathers were so grateful for that, they actually erected a statue to Jim Pendergast some years later. And I tell people, well, there's a statue to Jim Pendergast, but there are a lot of monuments to Tom Pendergast. And those monuments would be like the Jackson County Courthouse, the Kansas City Municipal Building, the police department, the municipal auditorium. They paved the airport, the downtown airport, and of course they paved that boondoggle, Brush Creek.
Yeah, right.
And many other things. Yeah. In fact, Tom, I think I was telling you the other day that Tom was one of the first ones, if not the first one, to bring the revolving drum trucks of cement to the construction site and pour the cement right there. So it was very high quality cement. So Tom delivered a lot to Kansas City, but he also had a gambling addiction, basically betting on the ponies. He actually had a race wire installed in his office, and then he would listen to the call of the races over the telephone. And he continued to need more and more cash. Mm-hmm. And so he started to rely a lot more and more on the cut from the mob. From the various sin businesses, and then he needed to get cuts from the salaries of all the municipal employees. And then he took silent partnership in about 33 companies. And so he was getting paid, by them. And so it was this kind of constant need for cash because he was considered one of the biggest suckers on the East Coast. They knew who he was because he bet these large sums of money. He lost so much of the time. Yeah. But he won sometimes. But generally he really lost a lot of money. But the story of Tom Pendergast is one of luck and incredible political insight because he just knew how to assess a situation. Harry Truman always said that Tom Pendergast had the greatest political acumen of anybody he had ever met before. He could take a scenario, an issue, and go 8 to 10 steps beyond where it was going to go and predict how it was going to turn out. But Tom also was not above cheating. Harry Truman was elected first time to the United States Senate. I know a lot of people around here don't want to hear it, but it's too bad because he was elected with somewhere between probably 60 and 75,000 ghost votes in the 1934 general election. And that's why when he got to Congress, he was senator non grata because everybody just considered him to be a stooge of this corrupt political machine. So
the boss in Kansas City.
Yeah, and Pendergast did continue to exert some influence over Harry Truman while he was in the Senate. And Harry got up on the Senate floor one time and made one of the most ridiculous speeches of his entire career because after the 1936 election, the largest federal prosecution of vote fraud took place, and that was they indicted 287 people here in Kansas City for vote fraud, and they prosecuted successfully 259 people.
Wow.
Yeah, for vote fraud. And so Harry Truman stood up on the United States Senate floor and railed against the prosecutor, Maurice Milligan. And these characters from the past are they're just something, almost
made up.
Dickensian or something. But so Harry Truman got up on the Senate floor and he said that a Democrat in Jackson County could no more get a fair trial than a Trotsky follower in Soviet Russia or a Jew in Nazi Germany.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that speech was not well received. And Harry kind of thought that his career was over at that moment, but he was able to ride the storm, and I think he kind of shut up after that. Everybody said, Harry, come on. They got these people dead to rights on this voter fraud thing. Yeah. And then what's interesting is that the man who prosecuted these guys ran against Harry Truman. And really, that's kind of a lot of what my film is all about is the 1940 election of Harry Truman. Because, we all know that Harry won the presidential victory, the famous picture of him holding up Dewey defeats Truman, right?
Truman, yeah.
But it was 1940, really, that he was hanging on for his dear political life because at that time, the governor of Missouri could only serve for 4 years. So the Pendergast-backed governor of Missouri was now opposing Truman in the 1940 election. And Maurice Milligan, the guy that had put Pendergast behind bars, was opposing Truman in the 1940 senatorial election. And Maurice Milligan got into the race because he thought that the governor was taking too much credit for prosecuting Pendergast. And I mean, and I'm sure Pendergast saw what was going on, and he could read this situation because 6 years earlier, in 1934, Truman had run against Maurice Milligan's brother, Tuck Milligan, who was a congressman, and he got into the race late. And there was another congressman from St. Louis that was supposed to be the winner, and this guy named Cochran in St. Louis, he said, all I need is 120,000 votes out of St. Louis, and I'm going to beat Harry Truman. So Pendergast heard that, said fine, and he delivered 125,000 votes out of Kansas City. And Tuck Milligan also split the anti-Pendergast vote.
Right.
So in 1934 you had an anti-Pendergast vote, and in 1940 you had an anti-Pendergast vote. And so Harry in 1940 squeaked by with a 1% plurality.
Oh, wow.
He just barely squeaked by out of all the votes cast. And, the wags of the day said, every day Harry Truman got up, he should have gotten on his knees and said a little prayer for the Milligan brothers because they both siphoned votes away from who should have been the major contender and, basically gave Harry the victory. But also Harry in 1934 had the benefit of the Pendergast machine financing his campaign and then also delivering, 75,000 fraudulent votes.
Yeah, right. And then the rest is history. And who knows the difference of what would have happened would whoever stepped in for Roosevelt at the time, would he have dropped the bomb on Japan or whatever? Or maybe we don't even manufacture the bomb at that time.
Right, right. I was just watching the trailer for the film Oppenheimer. And they referenced Truman, said Truman needs to know this,
Yes.
And, I mean, really, to put such an ordinary man into such extraordinary circumstances, just it's fascinating. Yeah,
the
really
buck stops here.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, we're going to wrap this up today. Okay, where we are, but we're going to have you back if you'd be so kind to come back and get this history of Kansas City down and have it evergreen, have it on a platform like this as well as doing the movies and the books and everything else. I think that would be just terrific if you do that for us. That'd be great.
Absolutely.
Great.
My pleasure.
Terrence, you are the most interesting man in Kansas City. I really appreciate this. I really do.
My pleasure. I'll be glad to come back. There's a really interesting story about the Anthony Bourdain.
Yes, we will do that.
His producers called me, and I didn't know who he was, and so I said, just meet me over. They wanted the connection between the mafia and barbecue. And I said, yeah, you'd have an easier time if you went Italian, you know. And they said, well, no, it's got to be barbecue because they were doing the theme. I said, all right, meet me over at BB's Lawnside Barbecue. Well, I forgot to tell Lindsay Shannon about it, the guy that owns the place.
He owns it, yeah. Lindsay does
So,
and has.
so
Yeah.
all of a sudden, Anthony Bourdain shows up at his restaurant and starts setting up with his crew. And I just forgot. I used to be the
and
piano
Lindsay's
player
going, "What
over
are you
there.
doing?" Yeah.
Yeah. And Lindsay's like, Terence, what is going on? I said, I'm sorry. I forgot to call you about this. And but he was great about it. So anyway, that's how that all went down.
Yeah, yeah. And you are Kansas City, which is great, and you're one of the reasons there's just something
About Kansas City.
You got it. Thank you, my friend. We're going to see you again
Okay.
shortly.
All right.